Let's just try a drop of this CRC Lectraclean down there. And it may or may not have a wonderful effect on that lacquer. It can't hurt anyway. Okay, well that screw is probably not going to come loose without some hammer assistance. I'll get my block of wood. Right, well that's supported on a block of wood. I'll take this suitably solid and otherwise ugly screwdriver, a couple of taps on the top. I'm keeping a lot of torque on this screwdriver. Give it a couple of taps and the screw comes loose. Now the two down in here, they'll need the same treatment, but I've got to hold the camera between my knees to do this, so you'll see nothing. That went very smoothly. Two sharp taps and the screws come loose. Lift out the struts. You can see that they're pretty grimy, a bit of dust, a lot of dried grease. Have the return spring for the shutter release for the struts. And there is a spacer washer, top and bottom, that sit between the struts and the body casting at this position where those screws go. You can lift out the take-up spool. That's Bakelite, I think. It's a bit greasy. This shaft, that shaft moves smoothly, we don't need to do anything with that. And that's basically the body stripped right down. I want to look closely at the state of the bellows where they're glued back to the body casting here to satisfy myself that the glue isn't giving way. It's that same dark brown shellac looking adhesive. Usually that I would expect that to be very good. Where you have problems, if you've got a lot of corrosion on a camera, often the corrosion has got down into that layer between the adhesive and the camera body shell, in which case it's no longer hanging on properly. I think I'll use a bright light to check and make sure that there's nothing happening there, but it looks sound to me at the moment. Alright, so that's their body stripped down as far as we need to strip it, I think. And I've got pieces that I need to clean manually, including of course the rangefinder and the struts. But these pieces, which comprise the focus helical and the vast majority of the other mechanical parts, including screws, they can go through the ultrasonic cleaner. So I'll get 15 minutes in a tin filled with a wax and grease remover. It's a product made for painters to use to wipe down surfaces prior to painting, but it's very good at hardening up this old grease. And then I'll get 15 minutes in a hot water with a strong domestic ammonia-based detergent, and that will get rid of all the other rubbish. And then they get rinsed out, dried carefully with a hairdryer, and by the time they come back here again, they look shinier than they ever looked before in their lives, most likely. So I'll get that underway. Okay, well about half an hour has passed. All these parts have been cleaned in the solvent and in the detergent, and everything is looking sparkly and new. So all these components are ready to go back in the camera. Of course I haven't cleaned up the other mechanical parts just yet. Well, I'm working my way through here, cleaning these body components up ready for reassembly. Now here I've got the focus mount, and I've cleaned away all the caked on dried grease, and it had just basically turned to concrete. But here, I don't know how well you can see that, here there's a little patch from here to here and here to here that looks like black paint. There's another little patch right here. Now how they got there, I can only assume that when this was being painted in the factory or later, that some dropped through onto those surfaces. Well, they're not helpful to have lumps of paint in places like that. They may actually cause a rough patch in the focus adjustment. So I'm going to have to get at that with a bit of acetone and remove that paint that I see visible here and here and here, because that might be making the focus stiffer than it otherwise should be. Very unusual thing to find. I'm going to put the struts back in the body. They're all clean and ready to go. They were in good condition. I'll put some synthetic grease in the slots at the back of the struts. I won't bother putting any grease in the front slots because it'll only end up getting rubbed off in my fingers. This piece that couples runs on the guide rail in the body, I've just run some synthetic grease through there. No, not synthetic grease, molybdenum paste. Likewise on the rail itself in the body. Here's the return spring, and fit that in place on there. And get this folded round the right way. It should look like that. Get that on the guide rail. Drop the struts into the body. Check that everything's sitting right. I'll put the 2 screws in the film cassette chamber. They should be the pretty screws because that's where people can see things. A lot of the screws will have various degrees of distortion on them. You want the pretty ones in here. If you do it right, no one will know you've ever been in there. Right, I'm not doing those up very tight, I'm just getting them in place. The next thing I need to do is get these spacer washers in, which go between the struts and the body, where the screws go through at this point and this point. So, let's see if I can drop one in here. Lift the struts slightly with the tip of my tweezers and manoeuvre that washer along into where it needs to be so that the screw will pass through it. That's right there. This screw can go in there, and this screw is noticeably uglier than the ones I put in the film cassette chamber. Another washer in the same position at the top. This one's a bit trickier to get in place because you have the guide rail for the rangefinder there too. Is that it? That's it. I got it into place. Now this screw, this is the post screw that goes in here. An unusual screw. It's countersunk at the bottom, so it goes into the countersink of the top cover. Now those 4 screws can be tightened up. and that's the struts back in the body. And I've just checked that they will fold up nicely. They do. Okay, next I need to get the focus mount back in there. So I've got all the pieces here. We start with the focus mount. I can slide that in underneath there. There are 4 large screws. Hold this to the front standard. And with the 4 all in place, I can now tighten those up. Okay, that's in place. I'll collapse the front and put the 4 screws through that will hold the bellows to the back of the front standard. Those are the longer black screws, and run those into place. Don't tighten them up at all until you've got all 4 in place. And you're pulling up against layers of leather and cloth there, so they're not going to come up hard to a hard stop, so don't over tighten them waiting for the screws to suddenly come up against a stop, because they're not going to. Right, so that's our bellows back connected again to the back of the front standard. The focus mount is in. And here's the inner and outer helical. I've cleaned these carefully. I've checked the action, make sure it's nice and smooth, and I've got them aligned. I made those alignment marks. Two here and 1 there, and that's at the point where the front surfaces are dead level. So I've got that in the right position. Of course, because I've got 2 marks here, I know that's at the bottom. So I can lubricate that with some helical grease. Alright, so here's the helical grease. I'll just back this most of the way out. We want a small dot in about 5 or 6 places around the perimeter. That's probably over generous. Let's get rid of some of that. And work that in. Just wipe off that excess. Right, we want some around this outside area. That's where it runs in the mount. And you can see the rub marks here, that there was certainly a lot of friction at that point previously. Presumably a bit of dust in that dried out grease. Right, and this runs on these guideposts here. The inner helical moves on those guideposts. And that's these ones here. I'll just put a touch in there. That doesn't need to be helical grease, it's just what I happen to have in my hand. Let's put this in place. Now I know the two lines went to the bottom, and a single line to the top, so that should go on there like that. If I check the actions, make sure it's smooth, and that's nice and smooth. So the retaining plate, here it is. It only goes on in one position, and of course it's pressing on that outer helical, so I need to put a wipe of molybdenum, what I've got, helical grease, that'll do, yeah, on the inside surface here where it rubs on that edge. That's always going to be most pronounced where the screws are that hold it down. But it doesn't need much at all. This only goes on in one position, and it's held in place with 6 small screws. Make sure that focus is set so that the inner is pointing forward, that it's forward of the outer helical. Otherwise you might be clamping it down into the mount and it won't want to go. Get these screws placed. Now these are identical to the 4 screws that hold the focus scale ring in place, or generally identical. But you want the 4 best ones to be holding the focus scale ring in place, because they're just holding by the edge of the screw head, and they need to be in good order in order to do that. Okay, well I've got the 6 screws placed there. I'll just tighten those up. And check the focus movement again. It's nice and smooth. I can put the focus scale ring in position. And of course we have our alignment marks here that I'd made previously. So I'll get the 4 screws in position lightly. Make sure my alignment marks are correctly lined up and nip those screws up. When you do the screws up, don't over tighten them. They only need to be nipped up and no more. You are not going to prevent problems with your focus mechanism by tightening those screws up a great deal. All that you'll achieve is that you'll distort the outer helical and make the focus stiff. If the focus is clean and lubricated correctly, these screws do not need to be very tight. Right, I've got the screws in place. Now I'll just move my focus scale ring until the alignment marks are where they line up correctly. That looks good. Just nip these screws up. Check that the action's nice and smooth. That feels good. And here is the arm. This is the plate that goes on the inner helical. So drop that through there. The arm should sit up at the top here. 2 screws on the front plate. Here, they're small screws. Do those up, And the screw at the top is the post that draws the rangefinder forward. Put a touch of synthetic grease in that slot. As the front of the camera closes, this arm has to fold at its hinge and pops back down that track like that. You can see how the way it disappears down that track as the camera is closed. Otherwise, if there was no hinge there, it would be poking out the back of the camera. And when you are in the struts are erected, you'll see that this is moving in a straight track pretty much, front to back. Okay, so that's all good. I could put the front door back on now, I suppose. Here's the door. Now there are two hinge pin screws. One's shorter than the other one. The short screw goes at the top. The long screw goes to the bottom hinge because this piece has to screw onto it. So make sure you don't get them mixed up, otherwise it'll not go well for you. Okay, so just check the state of this. Put a little bit of synthetic grease on these pins where it couples to the front standard. Hook the door over the track at the top, stretch it out and drop it into the slot at the bottom. That's in place. Take the shorter of the two hinge pin screws and put it in place at the top. Taking the longer of the two hinge pin screws, put that in place at the bottom. Alright, so that's tightened up, it's screwed into the door. Make sure that the front opens and closes. It does. Right. Now I've got to get this piece back in position, and this is always a curse. Okay, see what I can achieve. First I need the longer of the two screwdrivers. Yeah, that'll drive that. Now if I take a long pair of tweezers, I might be able to manoeuvre this thing into position. Poke my screwdriver down from the top. Between the two, I might be able to get this juggled onto that screw. Yeah, I've got it on there. I haven't tightened it up yet, but I got the thing on there. It's a miracle in itself. Right, so without carefully avoiding poking a hole in the bellows with my screwdriver, I'll see if I can get it connect back on that screw and do the thing up. Can't even see where my screwdriver's got to there. Oh, that's better. Sorry you can't see any of this. This is just one of those awkward tasks where I can't really see much either. That's it. So that's back on. So the door's back in place. Got to watch this shutter release connection here, because if it flops back into the body, that's not helpful when you're folding the door. Okay, so our focus back is back in place. The door's back in place. That part's all done. Can move on. I'll put the rewind on and the take-up shaft, I suppose. Well, here are the rewind components. So I'll put some synthetic grease on the inner shaft. Slide that in here from the top. Line up the slot of the screw hole over here. When that comes into view, I can see it's gone past the little ring. Put that screw in place. That's that dog point screw. Check that this moves freely. That looks good. Put some synthetic grease into the bush. Put the shaft up through the bush. Now, without just pushing on it, just lift that tab up slightly to allow it to pop over the shaft. That's dropped into place. And we had this retaining spring set on there. See if I can get that stretched over. Slide that down into position. That part's all done. And that can go on the camera body. Of course, it would have helped if I'd assembled it the right way up. I haven't. I've got that the wrong way up. So, that was bad planning. To get that retaining ring off again now. What I'd done is I'd put it into the bush here upside down. I could tell instantly because the countersinks for the screws were on the wrong side. Fortunately, all is not lost. We can recover from that little hiccup. That's better. Back as we were. Three screws here at the top. Do those up tight. Well, that part's good. Now the film advance. Let's just close this front. First thing to go in is the take-up spool. I'll just apply a little bit of synthetic grease in here around that boss that the take-up spool sits on. And on that spring that provides the resistance to that take-up spool. Make sure that's sitting in place. That looks good. Here's the film advance shaft. And its bush. So I'll put some synthetic grease on here. Slide that up into the bush and put the bush on the top of the camera. I've got to engage that shaft with the top of the take-up spool. Yeah, I did that by revolving the take-up spool with my thumb. It fell in immediately. There are 3 screws that hold this in position, and they're probably somewhat uglier than the ones that came out of the rewind. Or if they weren't originally, this is where the ugly ones can go, because they're hidden under the advanced components, and so no one will know. Do those 3 screws up tight. That's our film advance shaft back in place, and start putting the other components back into the film advance.